Today's workshop is Working with First Responders, What Families Should Know. I'm excited to introduce you to Kristin Chandler, coordinator of Team 2, where law enforcement and mental health crisis counselors collaborate, Deputy Chief of Police Sean Briscoe with the City of South Burlington, who is here on behalf of Chief Sean Burke, and Captain Nick Perkoff, who is a paramedic with the City of South Burlington Fire Department. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know that we will learn a lot. And I would like to turn that over to Kristin.
Okay, I am going to share my slides. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Kristin Chandler. I'm zooming into you from Norwich University, where I'm an adjunct. I teach in the criminal justice department here, as well as run Team 2, which is a statewide training curriculum for first responders in responding to mental health crises. So I'm going to run through a bunch of slides that just explains to you the training that is received by first responders in Vermont specifically for responding to mental health crises. And this training applies both for adult response and responding to children. So we talk a lot about what are the appropriate resources to send to a mental health crisis. And we talk a lot about alternatives to those. And as many of you know, things have really changed, I would say, in the last at least 10 years or so. We're trying to think out of the box these days. It's not always appropriate, if possible, to send a police officer, for example, to a mental health crisis. So a lot of different communities, including your communities up there in Chittenden County, have some great resources that don't involve first responders. But for the most part, we are relying on our first responders. And so what currently happens in Vermont for police training is a 16-week academy at the academy in Pittsford. As part of that 16 weeks of training, there's an 8-hour day it's mandatory for everybody who wants to be certified. It's called Interacting with Persons with a Mental Illness. And it's really, I've been teaching this class at the academy. I teach it along with a clinician because I'm an attorney. I teach it with a clinician and a police officer. We really need to change the title because we get into a lot more than just interacting with people with a mental illness. We also cover intellectual disabilities and lots of different potential scenarios. But this is all that's required in Vermont is 8 hours. What is optional is the program that I run, which is Team 2. And that's also an 8-hour, it's a one-day training. It's scenario-based. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a couple minutes. Some departments offer additional mental health training through a virtual reality and running scenarios. And that really just depends on the training capacity of individual departments. And then we have crisis intervention team training, which is, I'll be talking quite a bit about that. This is, it was only one department actually in Vermont who was ever, the entire department has completed this, and that was the Hartford Police Department down near the border with New Hampshire, next to White River Junction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is what's available for police in Vermont as far as mental health training goes. In that mandatory 8 hours, and just by the way, there's no required follow-up training. A lot of states have follow-up training, like a refresher every 2 years. Like for example, Massachusetts requires 4 hours of refresher mental health training every 2 years for all of their police officers. Vermont does not require that, not yet. I'm working on it. But in that 8 hours that they get at the academy, really we go through a history of treatment, the basics, really it's sort of mental health 101, as well as some of the intellectual disabilities. We talk about people on the spectrum and potential things that first responders might face there. We talk about working with people with Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury. Runs the gamut. We do the piece that I really focus on is the involuntary commitment process, so the legal piece. We always have a person with lived experience who comes and speaks to the class, and it's an opportunity for the class to ask questions. We talk about really the importance, the vital importance for first responders to use time and distance when responding to any kind of mental health crisis. And in fact, we start off by talking about just in general, responding to a crisis in general, not just a mental health crisis. Talk a lot about the use of force policy. That is a statewide policy that went into effect in 2021 and definitely affects how police will respond to a mental health crisis. And we also cover some de-escalation techniques. There is a pre-basic academy that some agencies offer. Vermont State Police, for example, in the last 4 years, have asked me to come for they give me 3 hours before they actually start that 16-week academy. And I'd spend 3 hours with their particular cadets or recruits, just talking in general about mental health, the sort of the language that we use in Vermont, our system of care. No, we don't get into, they haven't learned a thing yet. They don't know the law yet, so we don't get into that. But I just kind of get a feel for them, ask them what they bring, what they think they bring as far as responding to a crisis. We do an exercise where they can see what it's like to have auditory hallucinations. Others might do this in-house, but they get to choose the topics. But this is something that's been a commitment of Vermont State Police for the last 4 years. And they also started offering a post-basic. So again, they asked me to come back at the end of that 16 weeks. They keep their recruits at the academy for a couple of weeks, and they give me 3 to 4 hours. I take an actor with me, and we run through some role plays, and they have to team up in pairs of 2 and respond to a crisis. And I sort of sit back and take notes and give them feedback. So that's Vermont State Police's commitment to mental health training. Team 2, which I run, is a great collaborative grant between the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Public Safety that's administered by the Vermont Care Partners, which is the trade organization that oversees all the mental health agencies in the state. It's offered in 5 different regions, and that's because there are so many different resources available depending on what part of the state you're in. This is a scenario-based training, so we have 3 scenarios during the day. Then the scenarios are all facilitated by peers. So I have a group of about 36 instructors in those, spread out throughout those 5 regions. They are police officers, mental health crisis clinicians, and dispatchers, and they run the small groups through those scenarios, and we focus on the clinical aspects, the legal aspects, and the safety aspects of each scenario. It really fosters relationship building and encourages collaboration. Vermont State Police, again, made it mandatory for all troopers starting in 2018. This is a voluntary program. I can tell you that every single agency in Vermont, police agency, except for, I think it's down to 2 now, and those are the agencies that have like one person is the chief, the deputy, and the dispatcher. Every single agency in Vermont has sent at least one person through the training. We've been able to present this model at the couple of conferences, 3 different conferences, and we're really doing something here in Vermont that no other state is doing, which is bringing mental health crisis clinicians, police officers, EMTs, dispatchers. We sometimes state's attorneys come, sometimes emergency department personnel come, that we're bringing them all together in a room at one time to discuss how would you respond to this. They learn each other's limitations and language, and people are always very grateful for this opportunity. So we do a lot of things right here. The scenarios that we use run through as many topics as we possibly can. This year, we're really focusing on the new law that went into effect on July 1st that affects mental health warrants. But you can see the various topics here. We try to get in issues about veterans, elders, adolescents, suicidality, medical versus mental health protocols. So for EMTs is a different protocol than for law enforcement. And then I've already mentioned some of the other topics that we not only cover at the academy, but we also then cover it during Team 2 as well. And Team 2 was really our response to CIT training. CIT, the Crisis Intervention Team Training, is kind of the gold standard nationally for mental health training for law enforcement. It's a 40-hour training, so it's 5 days in a row. And that's really hard to do in a rural state. Really hard to do for small departments to send people to a 5-day training. And that's, so we created Team 2 back in 2011 and rolled it out in 2013, really as our version of CIT training, excuse me. Because we knew that people couldn't send, they just couldn't send people to a 5-day training, but they could send them to a 1-day training. So what happens in Vermont is a lot of police chiefs come here from other states and they get to Vermont and they're like, well, where's CIT training? Because that is the national standard. It was developed in Memphis more than 25 years ago. Now it's about 35 years old. It's really designed for major metropolitan areas, and it's more than just training. You really want to have a medical hub. It's about bringing together a team of people who are the most appropriate to respond to a crisis. And you've got to be dedicated to it. And I found this both with Team 2 and with trotting out our first CIT training here recently, is that everything kind of flows from the top. If the chief believes in it, then the deputies or the patrol officers are going to also believe in it. So we really focus in CIT, we add in the substance use piece along with the crisis piece. And so recovery coaches can attend, and some hospitals have embedded recovery coaches who will work with people with a substance use issue right in the emergency department. It's really all about trauma-informed care and meeting people where they're at. We cover de-escalation techniques. We talk about cultural and linguistic diversity. And it's really more of a kind of a wraparound, if you will, resources and training. And a big component of it are site visits. So we just did this as a pilot in Washington County. We did it in March for the first time, and then we just did it recently a few weeks ago. And this is our graduating class. We had 10 people. Which included dispatchers, embedded mental health worker from Montpelier. We had Barrie Police and Berlin Chief of Police. We had the Capitol Police there. We had a couple dispatchers and one firefighter or EMT. And it was just great. And the big piece of it is the site visits. I think I just mentioned. This is what's different from any other training. We take the time to actually take people to the resources that are available in their community. So because this was Washington County, we went to these places that are listed here. The Lighthouse is our inebriate program. We went to the emergency department. We went Turning Point for substance use. Another way is a drop-in place for people in crisis. Home Intervention is a 4-bed step-down program. Sunrise is a day program for people with mental illness or intellectual disability. They can drop in, they can get food, they can get a shower. They can work out in the little gym there. The well space, that unfortunately has been shut down because of the flood. It's in the middle of being rebuilt, but that was our place for people on the spectrum. We had an imagination station there along with a place where people could get massage and Reiki. The Barrie Community Justice Center is a place for transitional housing for people getting out of DOC. And then Good Sam is a shelter for homeless individuals. That's a beautiful place built out of a former hotel in Berlin. And this was funded through a Byrne discretionary community grant. 150 grand is run through Montpelier PD. It's good for 3 years. And I'm telling you about this because the part of the grant includes the ability to go around and create a toolkit and to go to other communities and help them create their own CIT program. So the way that those of us who work in mental health look at it is that initial training at the academy is a 100 level course. Team 2 is a 200 level course, and then CIT is really the 300 level course. We kind of definitely spend a lot more time brainstorming and focusing on things that work and things that don't work. This gives people a different perspective, and I'll just give you this example. When we went, we saw the Community Health and Wellness Center in Barrie. It's a clinic where people can get free health care and free dental care. And we went and visited it. It's a beautiful space. Afterwards, one of the cops said to me, you know, I don't think we need to go to that next time. It's just another doctor's room, and everybody's seen those. Everybody's seen an exam room. But one of the other people said, you know, I've lived in Barrie all my life, and I never knew this was here. And it's a different cop said, you know, I've known about this place forever. I've never been inside. I thought it was sketchy, but now that I've been inside, I know that it's really clean and immaculate, and I will now definitely suggest that people go there. We do lots of scenarios, and we use actors as well. CIT is an international program, so they provided some of the scenarios. And this is just a picture of one of the actors working out a scenario. This was a person who was passed out on the library lawn. And this gentleman kneeling is an EMT, and you get the officer in the background kind of providing support, but staying back. This was a couple of actors acting out where an adolescent did not want to take his medication or go with his mother, and she had called somebody in the public. This happened on a public street, and people called 911. So these are just a couple examples of the role plays. What's available for EMTs on mental health response is not a whole lot. They got a grant actually for the last class of EMTs going through graduating, and hired me to give them 3 hours of training that was virtual on the basics of mental health stuff. Every EMT who comes to my Team 2 training says, like, this is the first training I've gotten really in mental health response. This is great. And now, so they can come to Team 2, and they're always invited to CIT training in Washington County anyway. And when that expands, I think next we're going to be in Morrisville they've indicated they'd like to have a CIT training there. So those are that's the training that's offered for police and fire. Whoops, I'm not going to new share. I'm going to stop sharing. Whoops,
Kristin,
yep.
we do have a question in chat. We can wait till, I think we talked about waiting until the end, but this might be specific to your piece. So
okay.
It's the question from Martha is, wouldn't this training be very important in Vermont, given the rise in crime, homelessness, opioid issues? Vermont is struggling. And I'm not sure, Martha, do you mean the CIT training or the Team 2 training? I just want to make sure I clarify that.
I'm thinking the CIT training. From what I heard Kristin say, this hasn't occurred in and it's not mandatory. This hasn't occurred in all throughout the state of Vermont. And, you know, I'm specifically thinking about Burlington, which has really experienced major challenges. I know they're statewide, but I'm wondering if this particular training has been offered in Burlington, if anyone's used it. I'm just thinking we need as many resources in the city of Burlington as possible.
No kidding, right, Martha? I mean, you guys are really getting hit hard up there. And I know there's been some innovative ideas, like using the fire department overtime at Burlington Fire anyway, for a pilot program for 90 days to have 2 EMTs go out in a unmarked car, I believe, and be proactive as opposed to reactive to substance use issues. But yeah, Burlington PD talked about trying to do this a few years ago. It's just that 5 days business. It's really, you can't, if you're short-staffed already,
They're short-staffed
and go to 5-day training, it makes it really tough. So this second time around, when we did it in Washington County just last month, we recognize that because the Team 2 is a requirement. So that's day 1 of the training. And then we made a whole day that was virtual. We were able to incorporate all the topics we wanted to, the ones that we thought could be delivered equally as well virtually. We did that. So people had they got all those links 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time, so they had all that time to do it on their own. So we actually ended up with only 3 days of in-person CIT training, and one of which, half a day was doing the site visits.
Right.
So it really helped. The departments told us it really helped them to be able to send people, but it takes time. And when Hartford did it years ago, it took them 3 years to send all of their people through the whole training.
Right.
Because of staffing. They want to make sure.
Just thinking, state police have filled in the city of Burlington before in their hours of need, and that might be a creative way to supplement their police force and push the training.
Yeah, and you know what's tough
in
Washington County, we couldn't get the Berlin barracks to participate in CIT. They're just so short-staffed, they couldn't do it. They have made Team 2 mandatory, so I'm happy that they're getting that extra training. And when I talk about that we don't have any follow-up that's required here, that is an idea that I am pushing at the legislature, is to have at least a couple hours of mandatory follow-up mental health training. And I thought I'd get resistance from my police counterparts, and they actually said they welcome it. They already have a lot of mandatory training, but they want more mental health training because it's such a frequent call, or so many calls have some mental health component.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kristin. We've got a couple more questions, but I think I'm going to go ahead and hold those until the end so that we can hear from everybody, and then we'll go back to those.
All right, so let's hear from South Burlington Deputy Chief Sean Briscoe. You are up.
All right, thank you, Kristin. I just want to say I had the opportunity to attend Team 2 training at the beginning of the month. It was an outstanding opportunity to learn what the different resources are in Vermont. I'm relatively new to the state, and it was a fantastic training. Kristin, you do a fantastic job, and thank you for presenting today. I just wanted to get that out there up front, and how much I appreciated going that. Encourage anyone else that's here, if you have the opportunity to participate in that, please take up that opportunity. Something that Kristin touched on before was police officers responding to someone in a mental health crisis. Police officers do not want to go to these kinds of calls. We are not clinicians. We are not what is supposed to be happening. Law enforcement is traditionally law enforcement. We're there to catch people doing bad things. That has transitioned over the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years, into more of a public safety community service role, which we embrace, but we also recognize that police officers in a position of authority with the uniform and the flashing lights and the weapons, and our presence alone, no matter how we behave, can escalate a situation, particularly with somebody that may have had negative interactions with law enforcement in the past. So these are not the types of calls that we want to jump in with both feet. And if these things can be handled by non-law enforcement professionals, whether it be clinicians or medical health providers, that would certainly be our preference. However, we also understand that in today's environment, police officers are basically the face of the government, and we are who gets called most of the time when someone is having a problem, even if it's not specifically a law enforcement issue. It's a community issue, it's a safety issue, it's a health issue, and 911 gets called, and we're going, because the main drive behind anyone being a police officer is we want to help. So if we're called, we're going to go. Our response to persons in a mental health crisis is based on some fantastic training that goes on here in the state of Vermont, as well as model policies that are generally accepted nationwide, particularly the model policy put out by the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, which kind of guides how officers can best respond to and actually be helpful to persons with a mental health crisis and not escalate those situations. But what I want to talk about is what police officers are going to do when they're responding to these types of calls and the reasons behind it. The first thing an officer will do at any type of call, including responding to someone in a mental health crisis, is a risk assessment. It's to make sure that everyone at the scene, whether it be the person that's in the mental health crisis, people that are bystanders, and the officers themselves, to make sure everyone is safe. That includes assessing for weapons, whether the person has made statements that they could be a danger to themselves or others, whether that person has a history of violence, whether anyone in the family or anyone standing by has a history of violence, anything that could be an immediate danger and that could impede the successful intervention for the person that's having that mental health crisis. So we're going to assess the scene for safety and calm any volatile environment that may be there. That may include, removing any bystanders that may be escalating the situation. And it may also include officers just backing right off and letting the fire department, EMS, or other clinicians that may be there, or even a trusted family member that may have a better rapport and may better be able to intervene without law enforcement presence escalating the situation. And part of that is police officers are not qualified to diagnose any type of condition or to readily say, hey, here's what's going on and here's what's wrong. I apologize about that. The police radio is going on in the background. But what we can do, and what we've been trained to do, is recognize certain behaviors that indicates that somebody may be in that mental health crisis. And this is primarily for someone that we are sent to that doesn't necessarily have a family member or somebody else there that's familiar with the person or their crisis or their symptoms or what they're going through. And we look at these behaviors and these help us say, okay, is this person a danger to themselves? Do they need services? Is this a short-term thing? Is this a long-term thing? And what do we need? Most of the time, this is not something that we will just say, oh, they're fine, and walk away. That's not what we do. We want to make sure that everyone gets the help that they need. And fortunately, in South Burlington, we have more resources at our fingertips than a lot of the rest of the state has. Rural areas of Vermont don't necessarily have service providers that are on call that can come to the scene, that can help. And if they do, they could be a significant amount of time away. Most of the time in South Burlington, particularly during the day, Monday through Friday, there are generally more people available for these things. But as was said before, we all know crises don't necessarily happen at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. A lot of time it's late on a Saturday night, and it's outside of the normal hours for even the on-call providers. But when we're responding, keeping all of these things in mind, we normally will have 2 officers come. And this is not just for a safety standpoint or because we want to have that position of authority. That's not it at all. We do it for a twofold reason. The first is safety, because we want to make sure that we're watching one another, and whenever there is any potential for any type of scene to get problematic, we want to have 2 officers there. The second reason is that personality. We want to make sure that somebody is able to establish a rapport with the person that we're talking to. We're not going to get anywhere if there's that negative interaction, and it may not necessarily be the fault of the officer. They may not say or do anything wrong. They may just look like someone that this person has had a problem with in the past. So we want to have that second person available that can step in if that first officer is having a problem establishing that rapport and building that relationship with someone that we're speaking to. We're also going to request assistance. Like I said, we're fortunate in South Burlington to have these resources available. If something is a lower level need for assistance, we'll reach out to the Howard Center Mental Health Outreach. They usually can respond right to the scene and provide services and even food and clothing and different things that someone might need that might help them work their way through the crisis that they're in. Something that might be a little more serious, we would call first call. They have clinicians that can respond to somebody that is in active crisis, and that may even be a threat to themselves or others, and they can help us work through that and evaluate the person at the scene and make that clinical decision of what type of help that person needs. But all through this, the police officer is always trying to calm the situation, to de-escalate and make sure that everyone is safe. That is our prime goal, is to make sure that everybody's safe and to make sure that people get the help that they need. In extreme cases, we may have to seek what is called an emergency evaluation warrant. That would be somebody that doesn't respond to the referrals, somebody that doesn't want to voluntarily be evaluated, but is obviously an immediate threat to themselves or others. And then the police would have to apply for an emergency evaluation warrant through a judge and get that warrant signed, and then that person would be brought for an evaluation. That is the absolute last thing that we want to do, because that's what turns into an adversarial situation, and that's the last thing that police officers want to do. That's the last thing a family member wants to see, and the person in crisis certainly doesn't want to have things escalate to that type of situation. But that's the general oversight of how police officers, particularly here in South Burlington, would respond to someone in a mental health crisis. I hope that I've given a decent overview. I know I've spoken an awful lot, and I haven't had slides up to kind of distract you from having to stare at me. But I'm certainly open to any questions. If I left a piece out, feel free to ask me anything, and I'll answer to the best of my knowledge. Or if you give me your contact information, I can always get back to you after I find the answer if I don't immediately have it. So I guess at that, I will turn things over to Captain Nick Perkov of the South Burlington Fire Department.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Chief. Appreciate that. All right. So my name is Nick Perkov. I'm a captain paramedic with the South Burlington Fire Department. I've been in this business for almost 20 years. So this is my first webinar working with mental health clinicians. All right, so I got my PowerPoint up. All right, so you can go for the next slide. So a little bit about who we are and the services we provide. So we're a full-time career fire department and EMS transport agency. Currently, we have 2 fire suppression unit staffed with 3 cross-trained firefighter and EMS providers, and 1 transport ambulance, soon to be 2 in January. We are all at the EMT to paramedic level, and we are the second busiest and biggest fire department in the state of Vermont. Next slide. So one of the things I've seen in my last 20 years that is increased are mental health emergencies. On one hand, our fires, and most of those calls that we normally would go on a day-to-day basis are going down. But unfortunately, these mental health crises are increasing exponentially. And I can tell you, we already had one this morning. I'm on duty right now. We had one this morning, and we deal with this in some capacity on a daily basis. And I don't like using that term of mental health crisis, because sometimes the lines get a little blurred where it's a substance abuse issue, maybe not a mental health crisis. The lines get blurred really easy. Sometimes they're a 2-for-1, and they become extremely tricky. I would probably say the majority of the time that we encounter these patients, they're not the ones seeking EMS. It's a family member or a bystander that is calling us. And a lot of times that makes it even more difficult to handle, because now we have a us versus them mentality. There's a huge wall that's put up between family members and the patient. Sometimes the last thing that these patients that are in acute mental health crises, the last thing they want to deal with are police officers and EMS providers. So one of the things, we can touch on the tips for family members, but if a family member calls EMS or the police department and they don't let that patient know we're coming, they get very surprised. A lot of times that has an adverse effect and makes the situation even more tricky. Next slide, please. So what happens when we receive a call? This is very similar. I can speak to, this is how the Burlington Fire Department, the Williston Fire Department, and us in South Burlington, this is how we all respond. We respond very similarly. You'll get a fire truck and a ambulance responding to the scene. So you'll get at a minimum of 5 EMS providers. Just like the chief said, safety is paramount. So a lot of times if there's any sort of hint of there being a potentially violent patient, you'll actually see the EMS unit stage down the block, and we'll wait for the police officers to show up, and we call it securing the scene before we enter. We do carry ballistic vests now, which I never thought I would ever say that we would have that on the fire trucks and the ambulances, but we don't carry weapons. We're not trained in any sort of defensive procedures. So we have to wait for the police officers to show up. So for those family members that are paying attention and watching this, and they call for EMS, I wouldn't be surprised if the first actually person you see walk through the door is actually a police officer. So once the scene is secure, after we make contact with the patient, as Kristin talked about and as the chief talked about, de-escalation is one of the things that we really strive for. A lot of times we'll separate the parties involved. So we'll take the family members that have called EMS, we'll remove them from the scene, and we'll have a couple EMS providers touch base with the patient. A lot of times we will offer a medical assessment, including vital signs, because sometimes these things are reversible. In the case of a hypoglycemic patient, so somebody that has low blood sugar that is acting abnormal, a lot of times we can fix that. Another instance, if somebody's had a seizure and they're what's called post-ictal, that period after the seizure, sometimes they just need time for clarity, and we can provide that by just taking our time on scene. So once we kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with, then we get into sometimes, which is the most trickiest part, is what do we do from here? Do we transport? Do we not transport? And I think a fallacy a lot of family members have is that if they call EMS, there's that idea that if you call, we haul, and that isn't always the case. That may be the wishes of the family. They're at wit's end. They can't, they're not feeling safe. They call 911. We show up, and they just assume that we're going to take their family member or friend away, and that's not as easy as that. Obviously, people still have rights. We cannot kidnap people. We cannot force them against their will to seek treatment. We can do our best to bring treatment to the scene, which is using these outreach counselors. But some of the trickiest calls I've ever had to deal with aren't these big 4-alarm fires. They're not these big mass casualty incidents. It's actually at 3:00 in the morning in the middle of Dorset Street dealing with somebody that's in an acute mental health crisis that doesn't want to seek any medical attention at all. It becomes a good old standoff, and it's very, very, very tricky to figure out the best course of action. Next slide. So these are very sensitive mental health emergencies. Obviously, we call for law enforcement. Our safety is paramount. Like I said, we try and limit the amount of providers. A lot of times, if I'm the incident commander, I'll touch base with the patient and just have a one-on-one rapport, and I'll keep the other crew members either with the family members or actually staged in their rigs. We initiate the SAFER model, which is something that EMS, it's fairly new to EMS, but it's a de-escalation technique that we use. And the next slide, you can go to that. I'll go over that. So we just try and lower the stimuli. We do that by just having 1 or 2 of us in the room. We acknowledge the patient's feelings. We try and validate how they're feeling. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just ask them, what do they want and what do they need? Because a lot of times we go in there sort of in this bias by taking into consideration what the family wants. And a lot of times that doesn't necessarily agree with what the patient wants. So, a lot of times too, that'll point you in why are they in this acute mental health crisis to begin with. And sometimes the fixes can be a little easy, and sometimes these fixes can be extremely difficult. Sometimes the fixes are this patient's being kicked out of the home, and that's what set them off. This patient has been denied their dose of Suboxone, so this is what sent them off. So once we get an idea of what do they need and what do they want, that'll sort of open up some avenues for us to get creative and think outside the box on how to mitigate the situation. We encourage the patient to use resources. Again, that is when we bring in the outreach counselors, and we sort of give them sort of some recovery referrals on where to go from here. I will say a lot of these patients have been through the system, so to speak, where they've gone up to the emergency department. They've been held for multiple days, and so they have literally PTSD from their experience going through the system. And the last thing that they want to do is go back into the system, being held for days on end in the emergency department because there's no beds, and the bigger fix isn't quite there yet. Next slide. So sorry, these protocols are a little blurry, but we have two protocols that we operate under that are sort of applicable to this discussion. This one's our behavioral emergencies. So essentially, what it does, it starts out as a EMT provider. There's only so much you can do, and then as you sort of go down the algorithm of an advanced provider and up to paramedic, there's more that we can do to help mitigate these emergencies. And if you go to the next slide, this is where it speaks to our paramedics being able to sedate patients. And just like the chief had mentioned that invoking an EE warrant, so an emergency evaluation warrant, that's their last case, worst case scenario. This is our last case, worst case scenario, which is to pharmacologically sedate somebody to get them up to the hospital for care. Now, we can't just do this on our own accord. We have to call our physicians at the hospital, and we have to get medical orders from an attending physician to do this. It's not pretty. I've had to do it numerous times, unfortunately. And it takes a collaborative effort between the police department and us. And it gets ugly. You have to restrain the patient. There's, an IM injection that we have to give somebody. We have a couple different medications that we can give, ketamine or some benzodiazepines that essentially put the patient to sleep and makes them compliant. I don't like doing this. There's a huge level of liability to it. But sometimes this is in the best interest of a patient. If a patient's so acutely hyped up, and there's not all of our de-escalation techniques have failed. This is really sometimes the only option to get them the care that they need. So again, I'm not a huge fan of this. We used to do this more 4 years ago. Now I think we've as an industry have accepted the fact that we have to take our time, utilize more resources, and it's not uncommon for us to be on scene for 2 to 3 hours, and it becomes literally a negotiation session on getting the patient to comply with us, to comply with what their family wants, and to get them up to the hospital. Let me go to the next slide. This is our police custody protocol. Again, the chief sort of touched on this as far as getting a warrant from a judge to invoke the EE procedures. We don't do that. EMS doesn't do that. We just stand by and await for the police to get those orders. And then that's when we come in with the sedation portion, if it becomes that bad. I've seen it where this has happened and handcuffs come out and there's a struggle and we show up and we sedate them. It's not the prettiest. And I'll be bluntly honest with the patients that if, I hate doing this, I hate giving them the option, but the way I handle it is I'm as upfront, as honest about things as possible. So it's never, like I said, these are never quick calls. These are never easy calls. These calls are tying up, 5 EMS providers and 2 to 3 police officers. They usually get the supervisors out from behind their desk, and it's a joint effort, collaborative effort between the hospital, us, and the police department, and the mental health counselors that are there. Next slide. So that's kind of a brief overview of what we do, what to expect. I'll just touch on, Kristin spoke about her training that she provides, and in EMS, there is literally zero training that new EMTs get. I mean, there's a chapter in every EMT book about a brief description of, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorders, but there's no actually clinical training that we get when it comes to this mental health crisis. A lot of it is on the job experience that we've gained over the years. Some people are naturally good at de-escalation than others. It's all about communication. That's what usually works the best, is honest communication. But if there's a failure, not just in Vermont, but nationally, on a national level, is that EMS providers are literally getting zero training in this area. So that makes it very, very tricky when we're dealing with these calls at 3:00 in the morning. We only can rely on our past experience.
Thank you. Thank you,
That's
Captain.
all I've got. So shoot me some questions if in the chat room. I'm here all day. So
Great.
That's why I love it
Thanks.
when EMS can come to Team 2. It's great. But the tricky part is a lot of EMS in Vermont are volunteers, right? So it makes it kind of hard.
right, that's even for the career folks. I mean, we have one of the failures is the National Registry of EMTs sets our training standards in our continuing education, and there's literally nothing. We're so inundated with cardiology and respiratory and OB and all these other things that, ironically, one of the most complicated and most frequent calls we don't touch on.
Thank you. I just thank you. This is such great information. I really appreciate it. I think the way I'm going to address the questions is just kind of in the order that we received them. And would it be okay if people have questions that we submit them to you after, if we need to wrap up, and then we can send out the answers? Great. Thank you. So it's a comment from Julie. She says, I'm a first responder with Heartland Volunteer Fire Department. I would like to take a training, CIT 8-hour at a minimum. So she had that comment. Didn't know
I
if-
responded to Julie and let her know how to reach me to sign up for Team 2.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kristin. And then I see that Matthew LaFleur has his hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, and greetings, everybody. My name is Matthew LaFleur from Grand Isle County in Oliver, Vermont. I use he, him pronouns. But yeah, the question that I have for the firefighters and police department is, we have personal identification cards in place already. Why can't we utilize that system that we have, like, border patrols? Like, they already know about you. As how can we identify or notify police departments, or firefighters when they do an identification check? When you get pulled over by police, they have to run your ID. They have to run your insurance. Is there a way for, and I see the state police is starting to lead on this, is there a way for to know that person if that person has PSD, autism? Some way, a better way to get that notification ahead of time before they make a critical mistake, because those critical mistakes could cost departments a lot of money. Believe me, it's like, I have to identify myself as a person of color with autism to a police officer that has to back off now because they have to automatically switch their tones and scales, because they know if they do anything more than what they're supposed to be doing against that individual, they could liably get sued by the feds. Literally, it says it right there. It's like, is there a way a person with disability will feel comfortable letting a police officer know? And this is across statewide. We know sheriffs, limited resources. We know most of police budgets across cities and towns, and firefighters don't have those resources or tools because it's the ones that can be able to provide, but the ones that cannot, it seems like we are out of luck here. Is there a way we can coordinate this team effort, collaborate with the DMV, which they have the power to do so, and Agency of Transportation to make sure that this system that we're trying to stand up to be more accessible and accommodation for all, so we don't have to get into those type of bad situations off the bat because we did something wrong if we didn't know about it ahead of time. So is there a way to collaborate to make this system more efficient? Thank you.
We actually had a short discussion before this meeting started, and all the law enforcement agencies in the state of Vermont share the same database, the same records management system. And so everybody has access to everybody else's records. So if somebody has already had law enforcement contact and that information is in there, any law enforcement officer would have access to say, oh, well, this person has this issue that you should be aware of. For those that have not had law enforcement contact, but that information, would still be a valuable resource to police officers. As it was mentioned before, I'm not extraordinarily familiar with it, but I believe this started in New Hampshire and it's bled over to some of the eastern portions of Vermont that, people can go to their local police department and say, hey, I want you to be aware of this situation. I want you to be aware of these issues so that in case there is police contact, and then they would take that information and voluntarily enter it into that records management system so that, any police officer that has contact, would then have access to that information. Not all police departments in the state are participating in that. I see no real impediment to doing that. I don't believe that's a thing here in South Burlington yet, but I can certainly look into that for our own agency, and other participating agency as far as entering that information in would be on an agency by agency basis.
Thank you. I have another question. I think it was addressed in different ways, but if I wanted to see if folks had anything to add. Is there statewide training for first responders on how to help persons with special health needs during a crisis or emergency? I know, Kristin, you talked a little bit about the scenario-based training that's done. Is there anything you want to add?
Specific to mental health crisis, and I read that question to mean more medical needs, but maybe I'm misreading it. I'm not aware of any statewide training for responding to special medical needs. I am aware a few years ago, Gifford Hospital did a thing with EMTs in central Vermont. They had a grant, so in Chelsea, Tunbridge area, Sharon, where EMTs went out, got paid to go out and meet and greet basically their community. And so they could learn about, like, for example, where elderly people might hide their key in case they needed to get in at some point in the future. Meet their pets and know about, what to look out for, and get to know a little bit about their specific medical needs. But I don't know about any statewide medical training for that.
Great, thank you. We did have a question that came in ahead of time that I just want to put out there. It was related to rural first responders that attend to calls in rural areas and use volunteer responders. Any differences that you want to highlight in
Well, I
those
think
types of calls?
from the fire and EMS standpoint, and even law enforcement, usually in rural settings, where here in the city, Burlington, South Burlington, and Williston, I said you'll get a fire truck and an ambulance and 5 providers. In a rural area, you may only get 2 people on an ambulance, and that's more than likely what you're going to get. There'll probably be a delay in response, only because some of these rural agencies, folks need to respond from home to the EMS station and then get in the rig and then head out. So the number of providers will probably be less, if I had to guess, on the law enforcement side, and the chief can chime in on this one, but the state police will a lot of times cover areas that that have no municipal police department, And those state troopers could be on call from home. They have a huge territory that they cover. So that may delay the EMS response even longer until a law enforcement officer can show up, clear the scene, make it safe, and then have EMS approach. So I think the biggest thing is the number of people are going to be probably less, and the time is going to be greater for that response and mitigation.
Thank
And
you.
like Captain Perkoff said, the lack of resources and just the distances involved in the rural areas of Vermont. He mentioned the state police response and that they may be on call. The state police, particularly in the middle of the night, usually from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m., they don't have anyone out on duty. They are all on call from home. And if that's the only law enforcement agency covering that area, that could be a significant amount of time before that law enforcement officer is able to respond to the scene. So that's definitely a significant hindrance to immediate care in a rural area.
Great. Thank you.
Diane, I
I'm
just
just
want
gonna,
to,
oh,
I just,
go
sorry, I
ahead.
just want to address, so something that Nick talked about having no training in mental health response, which is why we want them, EMS, to be able to rely on their mental health counterparts and have them show up at a scene. As of January 1st, here in Vermont, the Department of Mental Health is planning a statewide rollout of a 2-person mobile crisis response, so that anytime you call, you're going to get 2 people responding to the crisis. One may be virtual, but one has to have a master's level license. I'm a little bit doubtful that it's going to be ready to go on January 1st, but right now that's the goal. I just want people to be aware of that's across the state for every agency to have 2 people respond. One may be a peer and one may be responding with telemedicine, but that's supposed to happen statewide as of January 1.
Kristin, thank you for bringing that up. I know that the Department of Mental Health is hosting a town meeting to provide information about that to interested parties. And we can put information in an email about that as well. Oh my goodness, I can't believe it's 1:59. We have just one comment about of someone noting that there's a form. I believe that's the 911 form where people can identify if their family member has a disability. I think that might be used in different ways across the state. I didn't know if there's a quick comment about that. And I see, Julie, you have your hand raised, and I think we should wrap up because it's 2, but if anybody can stay on a little bit longer, I think
I can stay on as long as you need to, so
okay,
I'm in no
thank
rush.
you.
I'm
Maybe
here for 24 hours at work, so
Okay.
I can't escape.
Thank you. Maybe we have just maybe 2 minutes. Julie, did you want to ask your question quickly?
Hi, thank you. I want to thank all the presenters. My name is Julie Colt. I'm a first responder in Heartland, Vermont. We're rural, and we are all volunteer. So I'm part of the EMS response as a first responder, and I'm also part of the fire department. We get a lot of calls that involve mental health issues. And I did get a response from Kristin about taking the team 8-hour class, but I'm also interested in being trained so I can teach my colleagues at our fire department and other rural fire departments. So I wanted to put that out there, Kristin, and for those of you with the Vermont Family Network, that even though I'm a volunteer, this is a critical demographic that needs to be taken care of. I am a volunteer. I am taking classes. I took the CREST class at Dartmouth Hitchcock yesterday. I've taken the pre-hospital life support training, and I'm doing everything I can, and eventually become an EMT. But in the meantime, we need help. So I'd like to get that class and learn more about what I can do in my community and beyond.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. I know I think we could have gone on quite long because this is such an important topic. I just want to thank our presenters today and let folks know that we have many more interesting workshops coming up, and that you can find the details about these workshops on our website and the links to previously recorded ones. You can also follow us on Facebook or join our closed Facebook group. We really appreciate you being here today, and please sign up for our monthly e-news if you have a chance. And thanks again. People who registered will receive an email with a link and an evaluation. Please, please complete the evaluation. This really helps us to make improvements and to fulfill our grant requirements. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.